Fantastic. So, beginning our time to talk about the Tudors and really what is the beginning of the Church of England, because that's where all of this starts, is with the Tudor dynasty. And this chart is really going to make a big difference for us, right? But just, excuse me, as a little commercial, just so you'll know more about the Center for Christian History. Again, there's our website. Understand that we are on Facebook and Instagram, where we like to promote each day these Christian History Today. These are little snippets. These are done for people who are, in particularly, might not be real big fans of following around and history sessions to learn a whole lot about history. That may not be their thing, but maybe just a little bite, a little snip of something to be able to know about what happened on any particular day in history. So in addition to our website, where you can find this right at the top of the page, you could also go to our Facebook page or to Instagram to learn more about that. So these sessions that we are doing are monthly. There's no cost whatsoever to participate. As a nonprofit, we're always looking for an extra nickel or two in somebody's pocket. But for this, we want to make sure that these are open to the public. Anybody who's interested in watching these, you most likely will be watching this from our YouTube channel, but there are other places where we'll be able to host this as well. So we also are doing in-person events of teaching things like we did recently on the history of the Protestant Bible. There's a whole catalog of things that we are beginning to put together to export to the world, either online like we're doing now, or also maybe in your local location, somewhere near you, where we've been invited in to be able to teach. So watch part of that. And again, depending on what time you're actually and when you're actually watching this, we have a podcast that is due to roll out the first quarter of 2025, as well as radio spots that will be running across the country out and into Canada that speak specifically to Christian history today. All right, so our mainmost document for us to pull from that we're going to really focus on as we go through all these moving pieces is this chart. If you want to print that out and pause this so that you have that in your hand, you might find it a lot more interesting and a lot easier to follow along in all of these moving parts we're going to look into. But just so that you'll know what you're seeing in this are three primary components that I think are important for you to see, maybe four. One is to know that we have three countries that are going to be our focus to talk about today. Maybe another one that kind of sneaks in through the Holy Roman Empire, but that would be Spain. So know that all of these people in this line right here are people who are representatives or a part of what we would call some of the monarchs and the royal families of Spain. Then here in the center part, we have those who are parts of the royal families and the monarchies and the higher ups, if you will, in England. And then the last one we will get to is in Scotland. So understand that these are kind of vertical components of who we're going to follow along in this family tree. The other thing that's important to note is what you can see down here at the bottom, this kind of pinkish rectangle are those who are Roman Catholic. Remember that the Protestant Reformation is going large and in charge whenever, maybe not fully in charge everywhere, but certainly going gangbusters in plenty of places in Europe, starting from the time that Martin Luther nails those 95 Theses to the Castle Church doors in Wittenberg, Germany. On October 31st, 1517. Has a huge impact into what we're doing here in the beginnings of these components of the English Reformation. And so there are those who were believing in and following and enjoying and appreciating and wanting to be a part of what was the Protestant Reformation. And you'll see those in these purple ovals, and those that stayed very much loyal for one reason or another to the Pope and to the Catholic Church. You'll see them in those colors. So a lot of this folds out. The last thing I'd point out to you real quickly is to be able to see these little crowns. And the crowns that you see here are either a king or a queen of England. Now, there are kings and queens in Spain. There are kings and queens that we will refer to in Scotland. But for our purposes of what we're trying to talk about today with the Tudor dynasty, we really want to make sure that we're focusing in on England. So the Tudors are all English kings and queens. They start with Henry VII here, and then his successor, Henry VIII, who you most likely will have heard of, and then Mary I, who is Bloody Mary, Queen Elizabeth I, Edward VI, who is all of these being half brothers and sisters, and then eventually to King James I, who is not a Tudor technically, although he's got Tudor blood in him, but I'm getting a little bit ahead. There is one component that I left out when we did this chart, and we'll get into that in a minute, but that is Lady Jane Grey, who actually was Queen of England for about 9 days. But because that was so brief, I didn't add that into that mix, but historians would certainly be able to tell you more about her story. So let's begin somewhere along the line of trying to dig into all of this, and we begin with the Holy Roman Empire. So history nerds love to be able to tell the joke that the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. Don't tell them that because they might not have believed you. But just to give you a visual of an idea of roughly where the Holy Roman Empire was at this point in time is right here in this part that we would call Central Europe. So it had parts of France. You can see some lines here if you're able to see that well enough. Modern day political lines that would draw out the various countries. So Austria, parts of Poland, Czechia, Italy, Switzerland, Luxembourg, a big part of the Benelux, that's Belgium and the Netherlands and Luxembourg that are here. Liechtenstein's in there. This is the main part of what we would call the Holy Roman Empire. And so the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, who is emperor at this time, is Emperor Maximilian. He eventually dies in 1519, but before he starts to think about his impending death, right, he wanted to figure out who his successor was going to be. And his family, his son, and his kids, his children, and otherwise, it wasn't a lock that they were going to be in it, right? Part of that is because his son, who was known as Philip the Handsome, which if I even tried to come up with my own name of how I was going to be known, because there were certainly so many Philips, maybe nobody else is going to say Nick the Handsome, but maybe he came up with that one on his own. I'm not sure which, but he had already passed away. And Philip the Handsome, we'll talk about it in a little bit because about where he is in line for what happens back on our flow chart. But Henry VIII of England, the Henry VIII I am, who we will see more in just a little bit, certainly one of the most famous, if not the most famous English monarch of all time. France's King Francis I and Maximilian's grandson, Charles, were the top contenders in taking over the Holy Roman Empire. To be the emperor after Maximilian dies. So Maximilian certainly was looking for his grandson Charles to be able to take that role. Henry VIII was kind of a long shot. There were others that were vying for this who were from within the Holy Roman Empire themselves. But Francis I was making a big push, and having the reason it was Holy and Roman is because it was intimately tied to the Roman Catholic Church. All of this can go back to 800 AD, from the time that Charlemagne, Charles Magnus, Charles the Great, who was crowned emperor of the Franks, going back, another history lesson, but crowned by the Pope. The ties between the Holy Roman Empire and the Church at Rome were very, very tight, and were Gordian knotted up, okay, in a bunch of ways. So there was a lot of intrigue going on. Who is going to be the successor to all of that? So Charles V ultimately gets the job. There's old Philip the Handsome right there, okay? And so because Philip the Handsome dies at a fairly early age, then his oldest son, who was Charles V, who did not look like that when he became Holy Roman Emperor, but Charles V ends up becoming the Holy Roman Emperor. And the way he gets it would end up later, he would actually leave and abdicate the throne and step down, probably because he was worn smack out from all of the wars and all of the other turmoil that happened because of the Protestant Reformation that went on throughout Europe. But that's another history lesson for another day. Charles was actually selected and elected by the 7 electors of the Holy Roman Empire. And for those of you who have ever voted in a presidential election in the United States, you will know that when you go and cast your vote, you cast it for a group of electors who elect someone on your behalf who represents that particular party or those particular candidates that are on the ballot. All of that comes and was drawn out by the founders of the United States from the way they selected the Holy Roman Emperor from the Holy Roman Empire. And so there were 7 of them. Another whole history lesson for another day about how those 7 actually came to be and who was there and who was not there. Some of them had the title of king. Some of them had the title of elector of a particular area. Some of them, and as you might be able to tell from this painting here, this drawing, 3 of the electors were also archbishops of a particular district or a diocese within the empire. And you can see them represented here by the red caps that they have on. And then these are their standards or their signs or their shields of those 7. So Charles eventually gets a unanimous decision to be the Holy Roman Emperor. And that's fantastic for Charles. Part of the reason is because not only was he, as we see in this yellow part here, the head of the Holy Roman Empire. And some of this will grow during his time too, by the way. So these maps are not exactly lined up for the first map. But the other thing is we'll see from your chart in just a second is Charles was not only from his father's father, from his paternal grandfather's side, not only was he going to be and was the Holy Roman Emperor, but he also from his maternal side, from his mama's side of the family, he also was the King of Spain. So you can tell if you are Francis I and you are squashed right here in between both sides of Charles V, you might be a little bit nervous, right? To figure out, hey, these guys have got me covered coming and going. So Charles had this entire part of his empire, which again may be part of the reason that he abdicated, and he probably just needed a good nap after all that was over. The other thing to keep in mind, right, is as we said earlier, the Protestant Reformation is going on full speed. Martin Luther has already nailed his 95 Theses up, and because of the Gutenberg printing press and because of the ability for them to be able to get information out to people in their own language and books that could actually be more available, not just because they were available to get, but also the price was way down because of these printing presses that were throughout Europe. Another history lesson, another day on jumping into the Protestant Reformation, but this is a big part of that, and it certainly leads to the big part of how we end up creating the English Reformation as it relates to the Tudors. All right, so let's go back to our chart. So we're see where we're picking up from, and part of what we're picking up from that I want to be able to show you right now is over here in Spain. So we'll start here with Ferdinand and Isabella, and Ferdinand and Isabella is the same Ferdinand and and Isabella that in 1492 told that Italian sea captain Christopher Columbus, go sail the ocean blue. So this is the same Ferdinand and Isabella. But notice on your chart, what you'll see here is anytime there's a solid line connecting from one box to the next, that means that is a child of whomever is in the flow there, right? And then when you see a broken line with a little M beside it, that means that they are those two people were married. So as an example, Arthur, who was Henry VIII's older brother, Arthur was married to Catherine of Aragon. Catherine of Aragon, because this is a straight line, was one of the five children, maybe five that I think lived to maturity of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. And so when you see a solid line, you see that. But in order to look at our Spanish heritage that we're going to check out as it relates to the Tudor dynasty, and this is a big component of it, is Joanna. So Joanna is Catherine's older sister. Joanna and Catherine would have two other sisters, both of whom married the same guy who was the king of Portugal. Another story for another day. But Joanna is the English way that we would say Juan, right? So John being the English name John, and Juan being the Spanish name for John. She was Juana. Or Joanna, the way that we would say it. So Joanna was in line to be the queen of Spain after her parents. So Isabella died first. Ferdinand was still hanging around. But unfortunately, as we'll talk about, Joanna was not ready to be queen. So there's Ferdinand and Isabella that comes from some free copyright on pictures that are out there and about. So Ferdinand and Isabella then have this daughter who they referred to as Joanna the Mad. So if you're looking at that on your chart, you'll be able to see her there. Joanna the Mad wasn't because she was angry. It was mad as that she had some very serious mental health issues. And so it was like the Mad Hatter, as we would learn, from Lewis Carroll telling us more about it from Alice in Wonderland. And so you can think about, good gravy, man. Are you mad? Have you gone mad? It's that kind of an idea that she was unfortunately had some serious mental illness. And so because of that, the nobles and the nobility of Spain were able to say back to Ferdinand, look, I know she's your oldest baby girl and all that's sweet and good and fine, but she didn't need to be queen. The thing that was interesting that made that even more interesting with that is that Joanna was actually married to our friend who we looked at earlier, Philip the Handsome. And so Philip the Handsome of the Holy Roman Empire, the son of Maximilian the Emperor, and Joanna, one of the daughters of Ferdinand and Isabella, the two of them were married and they had two sons, and one of whom we are focused on today is Charles V, who was both King of Spain and the Holy Roman Emperor. So around Charles then, and with ultimately Ferdinand's blessing, Charles was made King of Spain before he was made king, the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. So just notice that on the flow chart there, if you're looking at that. So you can see Ferdinand and Isabella, you can see Joanna. Notice that Joanna's got a sister named Catherine, who we're about to talk about. And then Joanna had this son, Charles. And then after that, then he had, Charles had a son who was Philip II. Philip II would end up marrying Bloody Mary, another story that we're not fully to right now. You can see why there's a chart, right? Already you're thinking, gee whiz, how am I even following all this stuff, right? Without some type of a guide, which is part of what we're learning about today. So now let's flip over to England. And so this guy that you might see right there from whether you know it or not, was a younger picture of this guy. So Henry VIII is certainly, as we talked about, one of the most famous, if probably not the most famous and recognized king of England. Notice, though, that Henry VIII on our chart is the son of Henry VII. And so Henry VII, who his last name was Tudor, which is where Henry Tudor is where we get this whole name of this being the Tudor dynasty. And Henry VII's wife, Henry VIII's mother, whose name was Elizabeth, there was a marriage between two of the more prominent families in England at the time, the Yorks and the Lancasters. And they came together in what's known of a time period after the War of the Roses. Way another story for another day. But for our components today, notice there that you can see Henry VIII, right? And you see him with his little crown there on the chart. Notice though that Henry had an older brother whose name was Arthur. And Arthur, at a very young age, was married to this woman, who you also see on the chart, who is Catherine of Aragon. This is Ferdinand and Isabella's other daughter, Joanna's sister. She was pledged to Arthur. She actually got married to Arthur. Arthur died of tuberculosis, and it was maybe, I'm going to guesstimate out here, 16, 17 years old. So they got married early on. You know, this whole idea of one royal family marrying into another royal family and having their children marry each other was certainly not anything different or new, right? We can go back and see what David did in First Samuel, and we can see where certainly his son Solomon did it exponentially, okay? Exponentially times exponentially, on where they married into other families for political alliances and for other reasons, to be able to think of their children as components of their greater empire. So Catherine marries Catherine marries Arthur. Arthur dies. And Catherine, using again a biblical principle of what we call the like Boaz and Ruth did, and Judah and Tamar did, or Tamar did because Judah made her do it on the it'll come to me in a second. Some of you are already saying it out loud because you know exactly what it is that we're talking about, where the older brother dies. And when that brother dies off, then the younger brother comes back in to be able to make sure to carry on the family name. And so that'll pop into my head in just a second. But this is the same thing that happened here. So Henry is younger than Catherine, and eventually we're talking about Henry VIII now. And so Henry VIII is waiting around until he becomes of age. I want to say he was around 17, maybe 18 years old when he actually ended up marrying Catherine. But here's Catherine, who I think probably gets one of the worst, rawest deals of any of this conversation, as well as historically, because of, you know, she didn't do as she didn't have as bad a deal as Anne Boleyn, as we'll see in just a moment, but she really gets a raw deal. And so she comes to England thinking that she's going to marry the future king, who dies, and then she ends up having to wait around for Henry to grow up, at least physically grow up. I'm not sure he actually emotionally grows up, maybe at all. So that's Catherine. So notice then on your chart, back on your chart, that Catherine and Henry have a daughter together after they are married, who is Mary the First, right? And so she's Bloody Mary, who we'll see about in just a moment. But notice very clearly here a couple of components that are very important to our whole story. That is, notice how very Catholic Catherine is and how very Catholic Mary is. Devout Catholics. Also keep in mind that Catherine's nephew, right, is Charles V, who is the #1 guy at the Holy Roman in the Holy Roman Empire. Okay, so next in line for us to point out, to be able to talk about here on our chart, and some of this information I've given you now that will be a bullet later, but that's Anne Boleyn. Notice that Anne Boleyn is Protestant, and she's very sharp. She was one of the ladies in waiting for Catherine, the Queen Catherine, and she caught Henry's eye. and that ends up being a whole big problem. So, we can even go back and find out that there are people throughout history. Cyrus the Great comes to mind, of we see in the Bible, who, the Lord can use all kinds of people in all kinds of situations for his purposes, including Henry VIII having a roaming eye and wanting to be able to find a new wife. So Anne Boleyn is there. Anne Boleyn has a daughter with Henry VIII, and that, who we know as history, is Queen Elizabeth I. So we certainly will talk more about her in a little bit. And then notice this third wife, the third of 6 wives that Henry has, is Jane Seymour. And after Anne Boleyn is beheaded and Henry marries again, he finally marries somebody that he thinks is certainly much kind of more his equal, somebody that apparently from stories and otherwise, he really loved her and he really loved being with her and being around her. But she is, while Anne Boleyn was a Protestant, Jane Seymour was much more of a hyper Protestant. So she had drunk the Protestant Kool-Aid early on. But notice that she and Henry had a son who was Edward VI. And note that as well too. That's the whole reason that a lot of this came about, is because Henry did not have a son. He did not have a son with Catherine. He did not have a son with Anne Boleyn, and he was looking for a boy to take over his throne and to be his ultimate successor. And that was a huge driver in all of this. All right. So just noting all that back again and who we just saw, right? So Ferdinand and Isabella here where we are in Spain. What's going on here in England with all these people? We looked at Catherine, we looked at Anne, we looked at Jane Seymour, who were 3 of Henry's 6 wives. The old story is trying to figure out about Henry VIII's wives. Some of you are probably already said this out loud. If you didn't say it in your head, was divorced, beheaded, and died. And the next 3 were divorced, beheaded, and survived, of the other 3 that are not in our mix for what we are talking about. Oh, the kinsman redeemer. It popped in my head. Okay, that's what we talk about, where the older brother passes away like Arthur did, and the younger brother is hanging around, waiting until it's his time to be able to marry his brother's wife in order to keep the name going on. So let's look at some of this chronology. I'm going to click through this pretty quickly, and you can rewind or pause or go back through part of that, because I know a lot of this is like drinking water from a fire hydrant. So in 1509 is when Henry VIII actually marries Catherine of Aragon. By the way, you'll see her name, Catherine. Sometimes it's written with a K, sometimes it's with a C, but C is the one that I went with Katharina, who would be there for Catherine. So in 1517 is when we see the time that Luther, right, actually nails these 95 theses to the castle church at Wittenberg, and really ignites what has already been building up for 120, 130 years-ish already in what would become known as the Protestant Reformation. Keep in mind, when we talk about the Protestant Reformation, these were people who were Protestants who wanted to reform the church. They weren't out necessarily for power and fame. They felt like the church had lost its way, and for plenty of good reason. And they were protesting that, and they wanted to reform that. So the idea of creating another whole denomination, another Christian denomination, because they wanted to take their toys and go home, certainly was not the case. But in 1520 is when Anne Boleyn kind of enters the scene. All right, so note that there. I don't do much math, but between 1509 and 1520, this is 11 years that Henry has been waiting for Catherine to give him the one thing that he wants more than anything else, which is a son. And because that didn't happen, and because it couldn't happen, then Henry eventually, particularly after he meets Anne Boleyn, sends Catherine of Aragon off to a castle along with their daughter Mary, and uh, uh, with all intents and purposes, as much as she could, Catherine was trying to be able to find a way to heal the relationship and to appeal to Henry's good nature. And there's a whole story behind about how all that fit, and we're not going to get into all of that right now. Okay, but in 1521, and this is what adds to the politics and to the backstory and to part of the scene of this, Luther is eventually excommunicated by the Pope. And it happens at a church council meeting, which were known as diets. Okay. And this diet actually took place in the city of Worms, as we Americans would say it, or Worms, as they might say it in Germany, right? Of Worms, Germany. So the Diet of Worms, Worms was a large enough city in the Holy Roman Empire. The guy who presided over that excommunication, the guy who presided over what would become Luther's famous phrase of "and here I stand, I can do no other," that eventually led to his excommunication of all that. The guy who presided all over that was Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. And so here was the guy in Charles V's backyard, Luther, who had for 4 years produced multiple books, multiple pamphlets, things that were going on all around them, left and right, where the church was being attacked by more and more and more people. And so Luther steps up to do these things that he believes is right, but stepping up on top of the stepping up is Charles V. And Charles V, who is not only not only crowned emperor by the Pope, but he also was very much the one who was very loyal to the Pope and to the Church at Rome, and did the duty and did the work of making sure that Luther had a, depending on your perspective, a fairly fair trial in his excommunication that went on. But he's the guy that implemented it and made sure that church meeting took place. Interestingly enough, also in 1521, because of the work of Luther, Henry VIII actually gets this title called Defender of the Faith from the Pope at the time, Leo X, who is the one who actually excommunicates Luther. He gets this title of Defender of the Faith because he's done this great job of telling everybody about how full of air that this guy Luther is. And the Pope says, yes, great job, King. Let me just tell you how great it is for you to be a defender of the faith of that. I'm so proud of you, of what you did. Well, that proud doesn't last incredibly long, right? It takes about another 10 years or so. And then what happens in the interim time is Henry wants to marry Anne Boleyn, who he is now fallen in love with. He wants to divorce Catherine of Aragon. And the only person who can grant his divorce, it actually was more of an annulment of what he wanted, was the Pope. And the Pope had to do that. Now, Leo X was already gone, and so it wasn't the same Pope. That's another spot that I'm forgetting exactly which Pope it is. I can see his picture. But he ends up becoming this Pope that Henry appeals to, and he goes to the Archbishop of Canterbury, which is the main Archbishop for England, right? Thomas Cranmer, and he goes to Cranmer and says, "You got to go do my bidding back to the Pope and tell the Pope I need a divorce." Well, Cranmer says, "Well, how am I going to pull that off? For what reason?" And so they come up with all these reasons, and some of them was that Catherine was not loyal enough, or she had been unfaithful to Henry before they were married. And Catherine says, "We both know that's not correct." And so you have these just kind of straight up theological doctrinal issues that the Pope is trying to make a decision on whether a divorce is granted, whether it's worthy or not to have it. But you lay on top of all of that the work that Catherine's nephew, Charles V, has done to defend the Catholic Church, and there wasn't any way that was going to happen. So the Pope says, "No, I'm not giving you this divorce." So here's the pivot. Here's the thing. Here's the component right here. That's when Henry then decides, well, you know what? Then we'll just create our own church. We'll just put our own church together, and I'm going to confiscate all this church land. I'm going to confiscate all the church buildings, all the churches themselves, the cathedrals, uh, the cows and sheep and gold you've got in your vaults. I'm taking all of that, and we're going to create our own church. And it's going to be called the Church of England. And not only that, we're going to have Archbishop Cranmer gets to stay around, and he also had some political things with Henry that he did on Henry's behalf, which is kind of being in his cabinet, and that's another whole component to look at. But Cranmer then says, "Okay, now that I am the head of this new church called the Church of England, I will grant you your divorce," and it becomes legit. And so this is happening in 1833, right? Henry ends up marrying Anne Boleyn, and that same year of 1533, Queen Elizabeth, who will be Queen Elizabeth, is born. All right, do the math on whether Henry and Anne were already doing a little bit more than holding hands, right? So. Um, Big year that happens in 1833. In 1834, Henry gets Parliament, the English Parliament, to pass a bill called the Act of Supremacy. And what that means is that whoever is the king or the queen of England is actually the supreme person who is the head of the Church of England. And that still is the case today. The king doesn't get involved in the day-to-day workings of the Church of England, but he still is the head of the Church of England. We all know as well that Church of England is much more commonly known as Anglicans today within Great Britain, within the UK, and also the church that is in the United States that is their first cousin. Part of all that is of course the Episcopal Church. So the Act of Supremacy declares that ultimately the king is in control of, or the queen of at least as much as they are of governing the country, or the Commonwealth, as they like to say, of the Church of England. There's a lot of pieces to all this that are certainly much more than just what we're talking about today. So, in the next year, Henry is excommunicated by the Pope. This was Pope Paul III. I'm almost pretty sure about that, and so he becomes excommunicated, which doesn't really seem to bother Henry very much. Cranmer then now has got to figure out, how am I going to develop a church? Now I got to kind of figure this thing out. And now I'm in charge of this church. While the king may be in name in charge, I'm really the guy that's got to pull this off. So Cranmer runs around to try to pull these things together, and the development of the Church of England itself was certainly another topic that we would love to delve off into. But he also commissions a guy named Miles Coverdale to create the Great Bible at the time. So as we talk about things like we have previously done, the development of the Protestant Bible, this is one of those things that they said, hey, we want to make sure that we've got our copy of what is Scripture. And so they pulled that together. In 1547, Henry dies, and his son, Edward VI, is king. Now, Edward VI, when he was born, his mother, Jane Seymour, who we just looked at, she died during childbirth. Edward had always been kind of a sickly guy. He also had tuberculosis. He never really recovered from any of that. He's apparently very, very bright. But Edward VI is now king, and so he hopscotches over his step-sisters, or I should say his half-sisters rather, Mary I and Elizabeth I, and becomes the King of England. Cranmer also creates the Book of Common Prayer, which is certainly around today, and certainly is very much a part of the Anglican and the Episcopal churches that you can pick up a copy at your local bookstore, right? So in 1553, Edward VI dies. I think he was 14, maybe 15 years old when he died. And so now his half sister, Bloody Mary, is back in. Catholicism is back in a large way. She rescinds the Act of Supremacy and says, no, England is back solidly in the Catholic column. So look at your chart. If you're looking at all of that, you can see that Mary does not have any children. So when she dies of cancer in 1558, even though she was married to her cousin Philip II of Spain, they did not end up having any children. And so now the question was, well, who in the heck is going to be king or queen? Who are we going to go to for this? One of the people, if you look all the way over to the right on your column over there, you'll see Mary, Queen of Scots. We'll talk about her in just a minute. But Mary, Queen of Scots was also had kind of rights to the throne as well, potentially, except that no, Parliament, who is becoming more and more Protestant and is becoming certainly as a part of the key defenders of the Church of England. Keep in mind, by the way, Henry was never any really pro-Protestant guy, Henry VIII. He was a non-Catholic guy because he didn't get his way when he wanted his divorce from Catherine of Aragon, but you couldn't say he was a rabid Protestant. By the time that this happens, that particularly after the reign of Bloody Mary and the number of Protestants who were martyred or were killed or that ran out of England, any of that, you would not say that you would be able to say that there are plenty of people in Parliament who were members of Parliament that wanted to make sure that there was going to be a Protestant on the throne. So they very quickly say, well, it makes very perfect sense. It ought to be his next child, the next child that is in line and is alive and ready to be queen, and that would be Elizabeth I. So she becomes the queen, reinstates the Act of Supremacy, and the Church of England is back in and it stays in. And so the Church of England doesn't move around anymore. Okay, it stays Protestant. It stays as the official church of England as it is today, or the Great Britain or the UK, or whichever way you would like to be able to say it. But notice as well on your chart that you don't see that Elizabeth married anyone. Actually, she was known as the Virgin Queen. And so those of us in America know that there was a colony named for the Virgin Queen, one of the 13 original colonies, which was Virginia, which is certainly the state of Virginia now, was named for her as the Virgin Queen. So after she dies in 1603 with no children, now the question really has to be really kind of twofold. The big questions is who is going to sit on the throne, and will the Church of England remain as the Church of England and Protestant, or are we going to go back to Catholicism being back in? So flick over here with you. We're almost through. Flick at me, if you will, go back and note these back to our famous chart. All the way over on the right-hand side, which you can see over here in Scotland. The question is, after Elizabeth died with no children, and certainly as part of what was the question is when Mary died. When Mary died, it was pretty easy to figure out, well, hey, this is still somebody that's Henry's child. It's Elizabeth. This is who gets the job, right? But now we got to figure out, and if you are this very Protestant Parliament, and you've stood up this Church of England and you started to survive, lo and behold, these 30, 40 years since Bloody Mary ruled, and we've kind of settled that question. The last thing we want to do is become Catholic again. So they go back to and open up the big book and look and see, well, who's kin to who? So they come all the way back, not only to Henry VIII, but they go all the way one generation back to Henry VII and note, well, there are some people still alive that could claim the throne. One of those, then, we could look at Margaret, who was a sister to Henry, a sister to Arthur, one of the daughters of Henry VII and Elizabeth. And she had married the King of Scotland, who was James IV. And these were known as Stuarts, not the Scottish, not the English. But Margaret and her husband James IV have a son named James V. James V marries a woman named Mary of Guise, Guise, from France, who is in part of the royal family and lineage there. And they have a daughter whose also name is Mary, and she's known as Mary, the Queen of Scots. And she becomes the queen with her mother, Mary of Guise, kind of governing and running the country on her behalf while she is a little one. Mary, the Queen of Scots, her father James died very, very early, maybe even, within a year of the time that she was born, certainly not at a spot where she was raised up around him. Mary spent a lot of her time in France and was married to who would be the King of France, still very tied to the Roman Catholic Church. Mary tried a couple of times to overthrow her cousin Elizabeth while her Protestant cousin Elizabeth was on the throne during the time of Elizabeth I's reign. And so she got caught once and she got caught twice. And the second time she got caught of trying to do a coup to put a Catholic herself back onto the English throne. Finally, Elizabeth said, "I done told you once, I done told you twice, and so now you need to hit the head chopping machine," right? And so she was beheaded, and she was killed for her efforts there of trying to overthrow the queen. But the thing for our purpose and pieces, and we'll click through this in just a minute, is James VI, who is James VI of Scotland. And so he is the one that the Parliament chooses. And so we were talking this just clicks us through on what we were just talking about with James V, Mary Queen of Scots, and then James VI, King of Scotland, becomes the new King of England. And when he comes to England, he becomes James I of England. And this is the James of the King James Bible, in case anybody's wondering or anybody wants to know exactly who that guy is. Another story for another day, a great story for another day, which is about how the King James Bible came to be. But now James I is the King of England, and even though he instigates and implements what we would call the Stuart dynasty, he now is on the throne in England. And so we can see, based off of the chart, right, of that you've looked at, how intricate all of this is and how many moving parts there are to all of this that really becomes this family tree overlaid with the parts of the politics of what's going on with the Holy Roman Empire, overlaid with the parts that is the Protestant Reformation, and all of these component pieces to come together. And from all of that, we end up getting the Church of England. So I hope you'll join us for other sessions as we have them. You see our website there. You see our email address. If you got questions or comments, email us on that. We'd like to be able to take them, even if they're a little bit snarky. We don't mind being able to have to do that, just to be able to learn a little bit more and let folks learn more about the things that are happening for the Center for Christian History here at Mississippi College. Hope you enjoyed it, and I hope there was something positive for you in all of this. Thanks. Take care.